We've got some great questions for you today. The main one is on chocolate and the cost of it, and whether it was just for the rich or for the poor. Thanks for joining us today on Questions and Answers with James Townsend and Son. First question, it's from the last Q&A we did. It says, why didn't they just whisk using their forks? Because many times in the cooking episodes, whenever you see we're whisking, we whisk with a wooden twig whisk, basically, made with birch twigs. And the reason why you don't see us whisking with a fork is because the forks generally that you see in the 18th century were just two-tined forks, basically for holding down your meat while you cut it with your knife. And just a two-tined fork does not work well when you're trying to whisk up eggs. Here's another one that came in on that same Q&A. Here's something I've wondered. What did they do about reheating leftover food in the 18th century? Did they even bother? Today, we have microwave ovens and toaster ovens, but it seems like it might be way more effort than it's worth to build up a whole fire in an oven just to reheat food, not to mention, I'm sure there's a high risk of burning your food. For example, if you throw in only half a pie and it's already fully cooked anyway. Perhaps I'm wrong about both of these things, or maybe there's some other innovation I am unaware of. Do you know? Thanks. Reheating your food. They definitely would reheat their food in sometimes, and it really depends on the food. Many references you'll find to certain foods are talked about actually eating them cold. And I think many times pies were actually more of a way of food storage. They would cook these pies ahead of time. They'd set them in the larder and come back to them a day, 2, 3, 4 days later and eat them cold. Wasn't a big deal. They were really meant to be eaten that way. Many times you'll see references to puddings the same kind of way. They would eat them maybe when they were warm right away, but they would also eat them later on when they're cold. They would slice them up and reheat them also, say, fry them in a frying pan and warm them up. So they had some different methods of reheating things, but some things they didn't bother to reheat. So there's kind of both kind of answers there. Here's a question on the Harvest Succotash episode. Is any squash acceptable? It looks like you're using an acorn squash. Would spaghetti or other gourd work out? Even pumpkin. Most squashes are going to work out just fine. Pumpkin work out great in this situation. Acorn squash probably, spaghetti squash probably not, because it would be all stringy and that might give you a very strange consistency. But standard squashes are going to work great. Here's a question from the last episode that we just put out, where we did the chocolate with ivy. And he says, maybe this has been asked before, but why an apron that buttons to your jacket instead of the typical loop around the neck style common today? I don't know the reason behind fashion changes or specific changes on products like this. But I do know that the vast majority of images you see with aprons in the 18th century, a lot of them have that typical triangular top with a single buttonhole at the top to hold your apron up. You do see other situations where you have aprons, say even a woman's apron that comes up higher. The women didn't necessarily have buttons up here, so they actually pinned them to their outfit. So even on the women's ones, they still didn't use that loop around the back. I'm not sure about when that loop comes in, but I do know that typically in the 18th century you're going to see it attached actually right to the garment. So we had a Q&A where we talked about barm, and here's a question that was generated from that. How would you store barm if lucky enough to get it? Would it be the same for the faux barm? Love your videos, by the way. I'm addicted. Storing barm or storing yeast in the 18th century was something of a trick. They had several different methods for it. One of the things they would do would be to kind of coat, say, a wooden bowl with thin layers of it and let it dry out and then they would come back and they would take those flakes off and use them for a starter barm later on. They would kind of wake that back up, put it in warm water, wait a couple hours or maybe a half a day or whatever, feed that a little bit and get that barm going. They would also do things like use a whisk. They would whisk up the barm, and then they would just hang that whisk up to dry, and the barm that stuck to it and dried off they would use to kind of whisk up the next batch, and that would get it started. They had other methods. This is one of the barm cakes that came from Conner Prairie. So if you go back and you look at the episode where we did the Ryan Indian bread, and she talked about making some of these cakes for kind of storing your barm or your sourdough for later on. And if you go back to our bread series, and we talked about yeasts, we actually talked about also where you can take your old dough, your leaven from your batch, and if you weren't going to use it right away, you could store it in salt. So they had many different ways to kind of store yeast for a later on use. Here's a really good question, and it kind of seems simple, but it's definitely a little bit more complicated. We get a lot of questions on the channel, and some of them are excellent questions. There's just no way for them to answer. No way for us to answer them in the kind of format that we have just right now. Some of them will take days to research and an hour or two to actually answer the question. But let me start this one out. It's on the hot chocolate episode. How much did wood chocolate cost in the 18th century relative to average wages? It would definitely be a luxury item, I assume. It's a good question, and it can be very difficult to come up with really quick answers to these, especially something like how much does something cost? Recently, somebody asked, how much did a pair of shoes cost? And even today, I can ask you, how much does a pair of shoes cost? And you'll say to me, well, I might be able to buy a $5 pair of shoes, or I could definitely spend $500, maybe a couple $1,000s on a pair of shoes. So the answer is huge. And depending on, the 18th century is a long period of time. So it's like 100 years. Chocolate definitely cost something definitely different at the beginning than at the end, and it was different depending where you're at in England, North America. Here's a quick answer. George Thompson had an account book that ended up being saved because somebody else actually pinned fabric samples to it, and it stayed in someone's library. So we have this account book from probably a lower level of gentleman, and he recorded what he paid for a lot of different things. And several times in the 1730s and 1740s, he buys a pound of chocolate. And in 1739, he spends 6 shillings for a pound of chocolate. And then a year later, he spends 5 shillings for a pound of chocolate. And then 4 or 5 years later, he's spending 4 shillings for a pound of chocolate. Now, the question was asked, what about this in reference to average wages? And that really is the key there. 5 shillings, 4 shillings. It doesn't mean anything to us today. I don't know how to equate that with exactly how much that really is in earning power or in other ways that we kind of judge wealth. There's a kind of a generic figure that you can sort of pull out. This gentleman was in England, that you can sort of pull out, and English general labor or wages in the 18th century, something like 5 shillings a week. So in this circumstance, if we took this chocolate, which we don't know, is it cheap chocolate? Is it expensive chocolate? We don't really know. It's going to be relatively expensive. For a pound of chocolate would cost you maybe a week's wages in this setting. So that one's kind of tricky. But when we look at other situations where they talk about chocolate, it doesn't sound like it's that expensive. It was quite often the breakfast of rich and poor alike. how much did that really cost? Was that an extravagant expense even for the poor, even though they did it? I can't really answer that. Here's another little piece out of a book called American Husbandry. And this is from about 1775. And this is, let's see, the author is an American, so we don't really know quite who the author is, but he's talking about the colonies and what they're like. At one page, he's referencing Pennsylvania, and here's a little paragraph out of this where he's talking about people in Pennsylvania. Their meals are 3 times a day and served quite in the English taste. Coffee, tea, and chocolate are of the best sorts, cheap enough to be commanded in plenty by every planter, especially coffee and chocolate. Sugar also is cheaper than in England. These, with good bread and good butter, give a breakfast superior to what gentlemen of small estates usually make in England. So, a quick reference. It doesn't seem like chocolate is that big of an expense for most people. That's what I can dig out for chocolate for you in the short. There's only, in a short period of time. I could probably spend a week or more on a question like that if I really wanted to tease it out and truly understand exactly, all the different references and whether it was something that rich or poor could really afford. Again, great questions. You've done a wonderful job down in the comment section. A lot of answers there that are coming up, and a lot of excellent questions. And these really are food for thought as we generate episodes in the future. They really help us understand what people are interested in. So I want to thank you for, again, the excellent job you do down in the comment section, and how little work I have to do to police it and all that. Thank you so much for that. I know many people in the past, and we talked about it probably 3 or 4 months ago, and it comes up in the comment section every once in a while, about supporting the channel. And Patreon was mentioned, and I did go ahead and build a Patreon account if you want to help support what we do. And I mean, one of the ways you can support us, of course, is purchasing products from James Townsend & Son. But many people aren't necessarily interested in exactly what we sell, but they still are really interested in supporting the channel. So I built the Patreon page specifically for that, and also as a way to have yet another kind of a community within a community. If you're interested in supporting us via Patreon, I'll put a link down in the description section. And if you want to do that, that would be wonderful and a great help. And all those proceeds will go directly to being able for us to make better videos, more videos. So I want to thank you for that. Thank you for all the support you give us, the wonderful comments, the thumbs ups, all the views, everything you do for us. Thank you so much, and thanks for watching.